going to move on to section 3, pages 7 through 9. The name of the section is The Ontological Priority of the Question of Being. It also helps us know how we know. Again, 6 short things to kind of work through. Number 1, Heidegger starts out by talking about how scientific research demarcates and first establishes areas of knowledge in a rough and ready fashion. This is what we're familiar with in terms of a university program, right? You have an English department, natural sciences, chemistry, biology, botany, astrophysics, philosophy, religion, political science, right? And these are all areas of knowledge that have their own boundaries. Anybody within one of those fields of knowledge knows that those boundaries are woefully inadequate, right? Every field of knowledge spills over into every other field, and it's very difficult to fiercely defend one thing as the center of any one field at any one time. You can't do it because there's too much that spills over. Chemistry becomes physics, becomes biology really, really quickly. And although they can be distinguished, they're not themselves impermeable in those distinctions. Number 2, the elaboration of the area in its fundamental structures is already accomplished by pre-scientific experience in the interpretation of the domain of being to which the area of knowledge is itself confined. The resulting fundamental concepts comprise the guidelines for the first concrete disclosure of the area, right? So if we're going to make something we're going to call a science, we're going to have some fundamental concepts that help us make the line between what's in and out, right? And so we take our ordinary use of reality and we make a line and we say this is a fundamental concept, and that helps point to what's in and what's out. Does that make sense? Third, for Heidegger, true progress comes about not so much in collecting results and storing them in handbooks, as in being forced to ask questions about the basic constitution of each area, these questions being chiefly a reaction to increasing knowledge in each area. So the more that you learn about what's included inside, the more questions that you should start to have. Why does this fit inside? What about these outliers? Why isn't this included? Why is this excluded? And things like that. For Heidegger, that's what true progress is. True progress does not include technological devices, right? It's not reaffirming what we already know and making it more and more certain. Progress comes in making ourselves less certain and more inquisitive about what it is that we think we know. That's how we find progress. And so 4, the real movement of these sciences takes place in the revision of basic concepts. Development is determined by the extent to which it's capable of a crisis in its basic concepts. If you have a science that's too rigidly or narrowly defined, it won't grow as a science. It won't grow as a field. There's no way for it to develop. The more it's able to have a crisis, the more it's able to accommodate crises, the more development becomes possible. So for Heidegger, number 5, what's philosophically primary is the interpretation of genuinely historical beings with regard to their historicality, right? We are people who move in time. We understand temporality. We can have access to pasts. We can anticipate futures. We're thrown into the present. And as such, we have a certain historicity. We become genuinely historical in that way. So Heidegger asserts that that's what's philosophically primary as a fundamental concept for what he's doing. That itself opens itself and breaks open in terms of questions. And then 6, he writes, it is true that ontological inquiry is more original than the ontic inquiry of the positive sciences, but it remains naive and opaque if its investigations into the being of beings leaves the meaning of being in general undiscussed. Right? So we're not going to get anywhere with philosophy without dealing with the distinction between the ontic and the ontological, and that's what I'm going to address quickly now. This is one of those distinctions that sounds like convoluted garbage, but once you start to think about these ways, even if you don't use the terms, it's a really helpful way to start to process and think through different kinds of problems that you might confront and face. So the ontic and ontological, the onto or the ont are both terms that mean being in Greek. And so that's they're both ways of understanding or addressing or approaching being. you can think about it in terms of the difference between actualized possibilities and the foundational structure of possibilities that a being has. So on an ontic level, it happens to be true that I'm tall. It happens to be true that I have a large beard. It happens to be true that I have tattoos and a tie, right? These are ontic truths. They're not necessary to my condition. The height might be in terms of genetics, but the beard is totally optional. The tattoos are also choices, right? They're ontic manifestations. They're choices that I've made on an ontic level based on the possibilities of hair growth. Right? As a mammal, I have a structural capacity for growing hair, which helps. And so on an ontological level, this is a structural set of possibilities that are open to me. I have more ontological possibilities open to me than my coffee mug has. There are very limited possibilities that the coffee mug possesses. It can roll, it can fall down with gravity's help. You know, if I throw it up hard enough, it can reach the ceiling. But its being is pretty limited to a container. My way of being is far more possible. The ontic possibilities of the container are to hold a liquid or not hold a liquid. Does that make sense? And that's based on the ontological capacity to have a watertight space inside suitable for the holding of liquids and beverages. Is that okay? Does that make sense? Okay? All right. So in terms of the ontic priority of the question of being, in this section, this is section 4, Heidegger is interested in discussing why Dasein is the best site for exploring the ontological question of the meaning of being. Right? Why we as thinkers are the best way to think about this, rather than looking at physics or astrophysics or chemistry or things like that. Why humans? What is it about us? And he goes through a few different steps. Number one, he says that Dasein itself is distinctly different from other beings. It is ontically distinguished, up here, by the fact that in its being, this being is concerned about its being. We care about our being, right? We care about our well-being. We care about our health. We care about our happiness. We have a concern about our being that differentiates us from other kinds of beings. My coffee mug has little concern about its being. I'm more concerned about its being than it is concerned about its own being, right? Does that make sense? Okay. Number two, Dasein always understands itself in terms of its existence, in terms of its possibility to be itself or not be itself. It's an identity crisis, and we're always engaged in it in terms of our own existence and what our possibilities are, whether they're true possibilities or false possibilities. Heidegger writes, Dasein has either chosen these possibilities itself, like having a beard or tattoos, stumbled upon them, or in each instance already grown up in them. Existence is decided only by each Dasein itself in the manner of seizing upon or neglecting such possibilities. Right? So we have a set of possibilities that are always in front of us. Sometimes we stumble onto them. Sometimes we grow up in them, right? It's a trajectory or a sense of world that really informs and frames how we think or approach things. And sometimes we choose them ourselves. But whichever one, whether we choose or stumble or just grow up in it, we always have the option of seizing upon or neglecting. Right? I can take this opportunity and grasp it, or I can let it go. And those are always possibilities open to me. The question of existence, this is back to Heidegger, is an ontic affair of Dasein. Right? Which possibilities I seize, which ones I neglect, those are all occurring at an ontic level. Does that make sense? Okay. 3. Being in a world belongs essentially to Dasein. The understanding of being that belongs to Dasein just as originally implies the understanding of something like world. And again, Heidegger reinforces the fact that you can't take being out of the world, or at least not the being of Dasein. The being of a questioner, the being of a thinker, essentially belongs to its world. It can't be divorced from it. You can't take being out of the world that it's in. And in order to think carefully about the meaning of being, you have to think about the world as part of that. And again, that's going to be the trajectory that we'll be talking about for the next 6 weeks. All right. So that's it for part one, in summary, very, very brief summary. Any questions so far? All right, we'll go ahead to part two. Part two is called the method of the investigation and its outline. Section 5 is the ontological analysis as exposure of the horizon for an interpretation of being in general. I think current publishing trends might alter the title of some of these things, possibly, if mass market distribution were of concern, which it wasn't then, it probably still isn't now, nonetheless. Number one, Dasein is ontically not only what is near or even nearest, nevertheless, it is ontologically what is farthest removed. Okay, so in terms of how Heidegger thinks about Dasein in its relationship to the question of being, ontically, it's not only what is near or even nearest to it, right? Unlike the coffee mug, I'm nearer to the question of the meaning of being than any other kind of being there can be. Does that make sense? Dasein as that which can take care of its, or cares about its own being, is really, really close to the question of being ontically. I can always ask, who am I? Why am I here? What am I doing? What does it mean to be who I am? Right? I'm very close to that question. Ontologically, it's what's farthest removed, because I always forget about it. And I always forget about its importance. And I just become immersed blindly in the checklist of the daily things that I need to do each day. Number two, Dasein tends to understand its own being in terms of that being to which it is essentially, continually, and most closely related, the world. Right? So, as Dasein, I'm really, really, really close to the question. Right? And I always have, at any point in my life, access to the question of the meaning of being. But I don't tend to orient myself there. Instead, there's the context of world that always draws my attention back into it. It's an inescapable grasp because I can't not be in my world. And so even though I'm always close to this, I'm nearest, it's also always something that's covered over or hidden from me in terms of a question that should be a priority. The world grabs my attention. We orient our self-understanding based on a horizontal assessment of where we are, rather than a vertical assessment of why we're the kind of beings that assess what we are. That's the difference between the ontic and the ontological. Or another way of explaining it. Does that make sense? The ontic is the horizontal self-assessment of where we are, and not the vertical assessment, the philosophical or ontological investigation of why I'm the kind of being that cares where it is. Okay? These terms become more and more handy the more they use them. Heidegger builds on them. We'll get there. So the meaning of being, as I said before, of that being we call Dasein proves to be temporality. That's the answer. He gives the answer right away. It's not a detective novel. There's no murder. There's no murderer. The meaning is time. What that meaning means is a different kind of question. All right. Section 6. Section 6. The task of destructuring of the history of ontology. In this section, Heidegger is interested in demonstrating the value of questions relative to the world of philosophy. And what he does through here is mostly talk about how nobody's paid attention to the question of being or the meaning of time. Nobody's taken seriously that Dasein is a historical being. And its temporality is really, really, really important to bear in mind. So he goes through Descartes, he goes through Kant, he shows how they overlook their own bias of tradition, how they neglect the importance of temporality, and in this way basically makes it so that he says, what I'm doing is something different and new. That's section 6. Make sense? All right. Section 7. The phenomenological method of the investigation. This is a pretty important section. It recaptures some of the initial mysteries. He goes back through how our naive and everyday grasp on things is both accurate and impossible. It's also an assessment of why an intentional pursuit of the question of being requires an outlook called phenomenology. Okay, so he goes back through and recovers some of where he started, and he also pushes forward into a certain kind of method proper to answering the question. So first of all, he describes phenomenology. This does not characterize the what of the objects of philosophical research in terms of their contents, but the how of such research. Right? Phenomenology is not interested in the whatness of it as much as it is the howness of it. And he goes on to explain. Phenomenon, from the Greek for Heidegger, means to show itself. Thus, the meaning of the expression phenomenon is established as what shows itself in itself, or what is manifest. Beings can show themselves from themselves in various ways. They can show themselves as they are not in themselves. In this self-showing, beings look like something. Such self-showing we call seeming. That's about 6 different mouthfuls, so I'm going to unpack that a little bit. So a phenomenon is that which comes to us in terms of appearance, right? What we have access to are appearances, and these appearances are something that appears to show itself. We can't actually know what it is that appears, right? We don't know what the phenomenon is in its own being, but we do know what it appears to be. The appearance, in the German as well as in the English, has 2 different ways. In one way, there's only what seems to appear, right? An appearance of something is that which is not actually what it is, right? Like in Scooby-Doo, oh, that appears to be a ghost, but it's actually old man Withers who runs the amusement park. It only appears to be a ghost. But in other times, appearances have more to do with what's actually there. Does that make sense in terms of appearances? But it's this act of manifesting, that showing itself in itself, that becomes important. There's a mode of revelation that moves as things appear in their seeming, right? It's what seems to be, and what I interpret it as is what it seems to be to me. And when I think about its seeming, then I can see whether the seeming is only a mere seeming, or whether thinking about what seems to be there will give me traction into a deeper, more rooted kind of problem. All right, is that better? Okay. So Heidegger says that one speaks of appearances or symptoms of illness. What is meant by this are occurrences in the body that show themselves, and in this self-showing as such indicates something that does not show itself. So if I have a symptom of an illness, it's not the illness itself, it's a symptom of it, right? If I have a fever, the fever isn't the illness, it's a symptom that something else is wrong, right? That points me down. So it's an appearance of something that's showing itself, but what appears isn't what I'm really interested in. Does that make sense? Okay. All right, so that's phenomenon. He then moves to define logos, which is the other part of phenomenology, right? Phenomenon and logos, okay? Logos for him really means to make manifest what is being talked about in speech. Logos lets something be seen. Speech lets us see from itself what is being talked about. That's what we do in speaking, right? We allow something to be seen, and the way that it's seen is framed by our language to be a certain kind of seeming of that thing, right? I can use my words to interpret, oh, what a glorious nice day. Oh, it's beastly hot outside, right? However my language frames a situation helps that way of its being become more manifest while hiding other aspects of it, right? My language brings into being its way of being in a peculiar kind of way. Does that make sense? Okay. What it does is let something be seen in its togetherness with something, right? Language always provides a synthesis. It shows what's there in its togetherness, to let something be seen as something meaningful, right? To just point a coffee cup really doesn't help. To know coffee cup as coffee cup detached from anything else isn't meaningful. You know, it's only when you look at a coffee cup as something incredibly symbolically powerful. I mean, you can do that with language, right? You can endow it with meaning that it doesn't in itself have. You let it be seen as something meaningful. Or a flag, which is a piece of fabric, right? It blows in the wind. The flag itself has no power, but we give it power by talking about it as something else, as the country. Does that make sense? Okay. So moving back to phenomenology, Heidegger argues, but what remains concealed in an exceptional sense, or what falls back and is covered up again, or shows itself only in a distorted way, is not this or that being, but rather, as we have shown in our foregoing observations, the being of beings. Right? So there's always a gap in what appears, both as a phenomenon and in language. Something is always concealed, it's covered up, it reveals itself through distortions, and that which does isn't an ontic being, right? It's not an accidental property of something, it's the very quality of the being of beings that does this. And for Heidegger, that's why things are so easily forgotten. That's why we don't address the question of being itself, right? It's why we have a forgetfulness about it. We don't hang on to it because the nature of the thing in itself is to slip away and elude us, to allow itself to be covered up and buried under actual concrete beings that vie for our attention in the world. Heidegger continues, it can be covered up to such a degree that it is forgotten, and that the question about it and its meaning altogether omitted. And that in some ways brings us full circle, right? And helps to explain why the question of the meaning of being becomes forgotten, why our average everyday insight into it is really important, right? It's only through our being confused, it's only through our forgetting, it's only through our inability to grasp it and hold it that we understand that the being of being itself is that kind of being that becomes an elusive, covered over, discarded thing. Does that make sense? And so that's how Heidegger sets up the importance of world, number one, for understanding being, right? We're not going to be able to understand being apart from the world, because the world and being have a relationship that's really important to how we care about our own beings, and being the kind of beings that care about our own beings are what gives us access to the meaning of being, or the question of being, that we'd otherwise forget. All right, that's the lecture.